I'm doing it, Marcus. Next week, I'm leaving Elisa. Elisa froze, her hand hovering over the study door handle. The wood felt suddenly cold, grounding her as the world tilted. You're sure? Marcus's voice crackled through David's speakerphone, sounding both weary and conspiratorial. I have to. If I don't marry Sarah before the year ends, I lose the controlling shares. Her husband, your brother Marcus, God rest his soul, knew what he was doing with that will. I get the company, Sarah gets me, and Elisa. David sighed, a sound completely devoid of remorse. Elisa gets whatever I leave her. She's irrelevant to the future of this pack. Elisa didn't gasp. She didn't cry. She simply withdrew her hand, the silence of the hallway amplifying the shattering of her 6-year relationship. Irrelevant. The morning air in the penthouse was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain and David's expensive cologne. Elisa sat at the kitchen island, a cup of untouched coffee cooling before her. She watched David adjust his tie in the hall mirror. He was meticulously groomed, as always, projecting the image of a rising star within the city's corporate hierarchy. A hierarchy deeply intertwined with the hidden structure of the local werewolf pack. He didn't know she had heard. He didn't know she understood the stakes far better than he assumed. I'll be late tonight, David called out, not turning around. Board meeting. Don't wait up. All right, Elisa replied, her voice steady. She marveled at her own composure. The revelation from 3 nights ago still pulsed a dull ache behind her ribs. But the initial shock had crystallized into a cold, terrifying clarity. He finally turned, flashing her a practiced smile. It was the same smile that had charmed her years ago. A smile she now saw was entirely devoid of warmth. Love you. The words tasted like ash. She offered a slight nod in return, unable to force the lie past her lips. As the front door clicked shut, the silence of the massive apartment descended. Elisa didn't move. She thought about the 6 years she had given him, the compromises, the quiet support while he climbed the ranks of his family's pack and business. She wasn't a wolf, she was human, a fact David's family had never let her forget. She had accepted her place in the shadows, believing in the foundation they were building. Instead, he was building a throne, and she was merely scaffolding to be discarded. Sarah, his late best friend's wife, the widow who held the key to the empire David coveted. It made sickening, perfect sense. Elisa finally stood, leaving the cold coffee. She walked to their bedroom, her movements deliberate. She opened the closet, her eyes passing over the designer clothes David had bought her, uniforms for the role she was supposed to play. She reached past them, pulling out a battered duffel bag from the very back. She packed only what was hers. Books she had bought before they met, a few cherished photographs, her laptop, and the comfortable, worn sweaters she loved but rarely wore around his associates. She left the jewelry. She left the expensive dresses. She left everything that tethered her to the illusion of David and Elisa. By noon, the apartment was exactly as he had left it, save for the absence of her minimal belongings and a single envelope resting perfectly centered on his mahogany desk. She hadn't written a long, dramatic letter. There was no plea, no anger, just a single sentence. I heard everything. She locked the door behind her, dropping the spare key into the mail slot. She stepped out into the bustling city, the gray sky mirroring her internal state. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to disappear. The city was vast, but David's reach within it was extensive. She needed sanctuary, a place where his influence and the pack's politics couldn't touch her. She spent the afternoon navigating the public transit system, deliberately taking erratic routes to shake any potential followers, though she doubted David would even notice she was gone until late that night. She finally settled in a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city, the neon sign buzzing erratically outside her window. Sitting on the edge of the lumpy mattress, the reality of her situation washed over her. She was alone, nearly broke, and suddenly untethered. But beneath the fear, a tiny, defiant spark ignited. She was no longer irrelevant. She was free, and for the first time in years, she was the one dictating the terms. A week bled into 2. Elisa found a modest apartment in a neighborhood far removed from the polished skyscrapers where David reigned. It was gritty, loud, and entirely anonymous. She secured a job as a barista in a small, independent bookstore cafe, a stark contrast to the high society galas she used to attend. The work was simple, the pay meager, but it was honest. And more importantly, it kept her hidden. She expected David to search for her. She anticipated angry voicemails, perhaps even someone sent to bring her back for a talk. But there was nothing. Her phone remained silent. The realization stung, a sharp reminder of how little she had truly meant to him. Yet it also brought a profound sense of relief. He had moved on with terrifying speed, fully consumed by his impending marriage to Sarah and the acquisition of the pack leadership. The news broke a month later. A glossy society magazine featured a 2-page spread. The merger of the decade, David Sterling and Sarah Vance to wed. Elisa stared at the photograph during her break, the smell of roasted coffee beans heavy in the air. David looked triumphant. Sarah looked perfectly poised, a woman bred for power. Fascinating reading? Elisa jumped, nearly spilling her tea. Standing by her table was a man she had noticed frequenting the cafe over the past few days. He was tall, dressed in impeccably tailored, dark clothing that seemed entirely out of place in the bohemian shop. His eyes, a striking shade of amber, held an intensity that made her instinctively pull back. "Just catching up on local news," Elisa managed, quickly folding the magazine. The man pulled out the chair opposite her without asking. "May I?" Elisa hesitated, then nodded. There was an undeniable authority about him, a quiet power that hummed in the air around him. It wasn't the aggressive, posturing dominance she was used to from David's circle. It was older, deeper. "I'm Julian," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You make excellent espresso, Elisa." She blinked. "I don't wear a name tag." Julian offered a slight, almost imperceptible smile. "I make it my business to know the names of the people who make my coffee, especially those who seem hiding." Elisa's breath caught. Her grip tightened on her mug. "I'm not hiding. I just moved here." A quiet neighborhood for a woman used to the Sterling penthouse. He observed softly. Panic flared in Elisa's chest. "Who are you?" she demanded, keeping her voice low. "Someone who finds David Sterling's sudden rise to power distasteful," Julian replied, leaning back slightly. "And his methods cowardly. If you have a problem with David, take it up with him," Elisa said, trying to stand. Julian raised a hand, a gesture so commanding she immediately sat back down. "I plan to. But I am curious about the woman he discarded so casually to secure his throne. The woman who walked away with nothing." Elisa scrutinized him. He knew too much. The way he spoke of the throne, he knew about the pack. "You're a wolf," she whispered. Julian's amber eyes gleamed. "Very perceptive." "Yes. And David's ambitions have begun to irritate people far above his station." "Above his station?" Elisa scoffed softly. David is about to become alpha of the largest pack in the city. There isn't much above that. Julian's smile widened, a predatory flash of white teeth. There is the king, Elisa. And the king is very unhappy. The air in the small cafe suddenly felt thin. The Alpha King, a figure of myth and terrifying reality, the ruler of all packs within the region, a name spoken only in hushed tones, even by David. "Why are you talking to me?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts. "Because, Elisa," Julian said, his gaze pinning her down. "David discarded you because he thought you were powerless. I believe you are the key to tearing his carefully constructed empire apart before he even takes the crown." Elisa stared at Julian, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The Alpha King. The stories she had overheard, whispers in the corners of David's lavish parties, painted a picture of a ruthless, ancient power that demanded absolute obedience. And this man, sitting across from her in a dingy cafe smelling of burnt sugar and old paper, spoke of the king with an unsettling familiarity. "I don't play pack politics," Elisa stated, her voice tight but remarkably steady. She was proud of that steadiness. "I survived 6 years of it by staying quiet. I'm not starting now." Julian's gaze didn't waver. "You misunderstand, Elisa. This is not about politics. This is about balance. David's maneuver, using a grieving widow to usurp a position he has not earned, disrupts the stability of the entire region. The king does not tolerate instability. So stop him," she shot back. "If the king is so powerful, he can just forbid the marriage or strip David of his rank. Why involve me? I'm human. I'm irrelevant, remember?" The words still tasted bitter. "Direct intervention is crude," Julian replied, taking a slow sip of his espresso. He looked entirely undisturbed by her defiance. "The king prefers finesse. David has convinced the elders that this marriage is a tragedy turned blessing. He plays the noble friend stepping in to support his late brother's pack. We need to expose his true nature. And how am I supposed to do that? I left. He won. He has the company. He has Sarah. And soon, he'll have the Alpha title. He has the illusion of victory," Julian corrected gently. "But illusions are fragile. David's arrogance is his weakness. He dismissed you because he could not conceive that you might possess strength. He believes he left you broken." Julian leaned forward, the ambient noise of the cafe seeming to fade away, leaving only the low, vibrating timbre of his voice. "Imagine the impact, Elisa, if the woman he discarded so casually were to reappear. Not broken, not begging, but standing beside the one man in this world he truly fears." Elisa felt a cold shiver trace its way down her spine. The implications were staggering. "You're suggesting I am proposing," Julian said, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made the air feel heavy. "An arrangement. You will accompany me to his wedding. You will be introduced to his world, not as the quiet human girlfriend he kept in the shadows, but as the chosen companion of the Alpha King." Silence stretched between them, thick and fraught with unspoken tension. Elisa's mind raced. The idea was absurd. It was dangerous. It was exactly the kind of high-stakes game she had spent years trying to avoid. But a treacherous, deeply satisfying image flashed in her mind. David's face, smug and triumphant, shattering as she walked through the doors of his grand wedding, radiant and untouchable. "Why me?" she asked finally, her voice barely a whisper. "Why not find someone from your own world to play this part?" Because the impact lies in the history, Julian explained. A stranger is just a stranger. But your presence will unravel him. It will show the elders that his judgment is flawed, his loyalty hollow. It will be the catalyst that exposes the rot beneath his polished surface. He stood up, dropping a crisp $50 bill onto the table. You have 3 days, Elisa. If you are tired of being the scaffolding, perhaps it is time you helped tear the building down. He turned and walked toward the door, pausing just before stepping out into the fading afternoon light. I will return on Thursday. Have your answer ready. The bell above the door jingled, a cheerful sound that felt entirely at odds with the storm raging inside her. Elisa sat alone for a long time, staring at the cold dregs of her tea. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But beneath it, the spark of defiance had grown into a steady, burning flame. The next 3 days were a blur of nervous energy and frantic internal debate. Elisa went through the motions of her job, steaming milk and wiping down counters. But her mind was consumed by Julian's offer. The logical, self-preserving part of her screamed to run, to pack her bags again, and disappear further into the city's underbelly. But the memory of David's voice on that phone call, "She's irrelevant," played on a continuous loop. When Thursday arrived, Elisa was waiting at a corner booth, dressed in her best, albeit simple outfit. Julian arrived exactly at noon. He didn't ask. He simply looked at her, one eyebrow raised in a silent query. "I have conditions," Elisa said, her voice surprisingly firm. Julian's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. "I would expect nothing less. State them. I am not a pawn to be used and discarded once this is over," she began, ticking the points off on her fingers. "I need protection. Real protection from David and his pack, during and after the wedding." "Granted," Julian said smoothly. "You will be under the direct protection of the king. To harm you would be an act of war." Elisa swallowed hard, the reality of the stakes pressing down on her. "And I need my independence. I won't owe you or the king a debt I can't repay. Once David is exposed, our arrangement is over. I go back to my life." Julian tilted his head, studying her intently. "You believe you can simply return to pouring coffee after standing in the center of the storm?" "That's my choice," she insisted. "Very well, granted." He extended a hand across the table. "Do we have an accord, Elisa?" She looked at his hand, large and elegant, realizing that taking it meant stepping off a cliff into an unknown abyss. With a deep breath, she reached out and placed her hand in his. His grip was warm and surprisingly gentle. "We have an accord," she said. The transformation began almost immediately. Julian didn't take her to a stylist or a boutique. He took her to a discreet, sprawling estate outside the city limits. The grounds were heavily guarded by men and women, whose stillness spoke of barely restrained power. For the next 2 weeks, Elisa was immersed in a crash course on pack politics, etiquette, and the complex hierarchy of their world. She learned the subtle nuances of scent and body language, the unspoken rules of dominance and submission that governed their interactions. "You are not trying to be a wolf," Julian instructed her during one grueling session in the estate's library. "You are human. Do not try to mimic them. Your strength lies in your humanity, your stillness, your poise. You must be an unshakable point of calm in a room full of predators." The physical transformation was subtle but profound. Under the guidance of the estate's staff, her wardrobe was overhauled, replacing her comfortable, worn clothes with garments that spoke of quiet, undeniable power. Sleek silhouettes, rich fabrics, colors that commanded attention without demanding it. On the evening before the wedding, Elisa stood before a full-length mirror in her opulent guest suite. The woman looking back at her was unrecognizable from the barista who had hidden in a cheap motel. She wore a deep emerald gown that clung to her curves before flowing into a dramatic train. Her hair, usually pulled back in a practical ponytail, cascaded over her shoulders in dark waves. Julian stood in the doorway, watching her. "You look—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Formidable." Elisa turned to face him, feeling a sudden, terrifying surge of confidence. "I feel formidable." "Tomorrow," Julian said, his voice dropping to that low, resonant rumble. "You will need to be." He stepped into the room, holding out a small velvet box. "The king requires that his companion wear a mark of his favor." Elisa took the box, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside rested a necklace, a delicate, intricate chain of white gold, holding a single, flawless, blood-red ruby. It wasn't merely jewelry. It felt heavy with significance, a silent declaration of ownership and protection. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "It is a warning," Julian corrected quietly. "To anyone who looks at you," as he fastened the clasp around her neck, the cold metal resting against her collarbone. Elisa knew there was no turning back. Tomorrow, she would face the man who had broken her. But she would not be the same woman who had left him. She was walking into the lion's den, draped in the colors of the king. The sterling Pack estate was a testament to old money and new ambition. Nestled deep within a private forest reserve on the edge of the city, the sprawling mansion was ablaze with light, a beacon of celebration against the dark night sky. Cars lined the winding driveway, sleek black sedans and expensive sports cars, each disgorging guests clad in their finest attire. This wasn't merely a wedding. It was a coronation. Elisa sat in the back of the armored limousine, the tinted windows shielding her from the curious glances of the valets. Beside her, Julian was a study in stillness, a dark presence radiating quiet authority. The silence in the car was profound, broken only by the crunch of gravel under the tires. She smoothed the skirt of her emerald gown, her hands surprisingly steady. The terror she had expected hadn't materialized. Instead, there was a cold, sharp focus settling over her, a detachment she hadn't known she possessed. She touched the ruby resting at her throat. It felt like a talisman. "Remember?" Julian said softly as the car glided to a halt near the grand entrance. "You do not need to explain yourself. You do not need to justify your presence. You are with me." Elisa met his amber gaze. "I understand." The chauffeur opened the door, and Julian stepped out first, offering his hand. As Elisa took it and emerged into the cool night air, she felt the immediate shift in atmosphere. The estate was humming with energy, not just the excitement of the guests, but the primal, subtle vibrations of a pack gathering. As they approached the massive double doors, the chatter near the entrance died down. Eyes turned toward them. Elisa recognized faces from the countless dinners and galas she had attended as David's irrelevant girlfriend. She saw the initial confusion, the furrowed brows as they struggled to place her, followed by the shock of recognition. She didn't look away. She kept her chin high, her expression serene, leaning slightly into Julian's side. The transformation was complete. She wasn't Elisa, the quiet human who blended into the wallpaper. She was the companion of the man who commanded the very ground they stood on. The grand ballroom was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the sea of guests. Elaborate floral arrangements scented the air. At the far end of the room, a raised dais held a beautifully adorned archway, where the ceremony would soon take place. "He is over there," Julian murmured, barely moving his lips. Elisa followed his subtle gesture. David stood near the bar, surrounded by a tight knot of pack elders and influential businessmen. He looked immaculate in a tailored tuxedo, exuding confidence and power. Beside him stood Sarah, radiant in a white gown that must have cost a small fortune, her hand resting possessively on his arm. They looked like the perfect couple, the very image of tragic destiny fulfilled. Elisa felt a flicker of the old pain, a phantom ache from a wound that had healed over, but it was quickly eclipsed by a surge of cold fury. She watched as David laughed at something an elder said, his smile wide and easy. Julian guided her deeper into the room, their path seeming to clear effortlessly as people instinctively stepped aside. The whispers started, a low murmur that rippled through the crowd like a wave. "Is that? It can't be. Not her. Who is she with?" Then, the murmurs changed tone. The whispers became sharp, urgent. Recognition of Julian sparked among the older, more powerful members of the pack. The air grew thick with tension, the festive atmosphere suddenly brittle. David turned, sensing the shift in the room. His eyes scanned the crowd, the practiced smile still lingering on his lips, until his gaze landed on Julian. His smile faltered. Then, his eyes slid to the woman standing beside him. Elisa watched the color drain from David's face. The shock was absolute. He stared at her, uncomprehending, his mind clearly struggling to reconcile the woman before him with the quiet, unassuming girlfriend he had discarded so easily. She held his gaze, her expression unreadable. She didn't glare, she didn't smile. She simply let him look, let him absorb the reality of her presence and the undeniable statement it made. She saw the exact moment his eyes flicked down to the ruby resting at her throat. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He stumbled back slightly, bumping into the bar, his composure shattering completely. "Let the games begin," Julian whispered. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, heavy and suffocating. The music had abruptly stopped, the musicians sensing the sudden, dangerous shift in the atmosphere. Every eye in the room was fixed on the confrontation unfolding near the bar. David's mouth opened and closed silently, his shock paralyzing him. Beside him, Sarah looked confused, her gaze darting between David and the striking couple who had just halted the entire celebration. Julian, an older man, Marcus, David's uncle and the current, albeit temporary, pack leader, stepped forward. His voice trembled slightly, despite his effort to project authority. We did not expect the king's emissary tonight. My presence was requested," Julian stated clearly, his voice carrying effortlessly across the silent room. Though perhaps not by the groom, he led Elisa forward, stopping a few feet from David. The proximity was electrifying. Elisa could smell David's expensive cologne, now mixed with the sharp tang of his sudden, acrid fear. "Elisa," David finally managed to choke out, the name sounding foreign on his tongue. What are you doing here?" "I was invited," Elisa replied, her voice cool and even. The steadiness of her tone surprised even her. She felt untouchable. Sarah finally recognized her. Her eyes widened, a flash of genuine panic crossing her delicate features. "David, what is she doing here? Why is she wearing—" She trailed off, staring at the ruby, her knowledge of pack lore clearly sufficient to understand its significance. Ah, that is an excellent question, Sarah. Julian interjected smoothly. Though perhaps the better question is why David felt the need to assure the elders that his former companion was irrelevant, a human easily dismissed and forgotten. A murmur ran through the assembled elders. This was dangerous territory. Challenging a groom on his wedding day, especially regarding a former human lover, was a direct insult, one that usually demanded immediate, violent retribution. David rallied, his face flushing dark red. The shock was fading, replaced by a desperate, rising anger. "This is an outrage," he snarled, trying to inject dominance into his voice, though it cracked slightly under the pressure. "You bring a human, my discarded human, to disrupt my wedding? This is a private pact matter, Julian. Even the king's emissary must respect our traditions." "The king respects truth, David," Julian countered, his tone hardening. "And you have built this marriage, this ascension, on a foundation of lies." "Lies?" Marcus demanded, stepping between them. "What lies?" "David stepped up when my brother died. He is taking care of Sarah, securing the pact's future." "Is he?" Julian turned to Marcus, his amber eyes burning. Or did he seize an opportunity? He abandoned a woman who stood by him for 6 years, dismissing her as irrelevant simply to gain control of your brother's shares. He manipulated the elders into believing this was a tragedy turned blessing, rather than a calculated, cold-blooded acquisition. "He's lying," David shouted, his control slipping. "Elisa meant nothing. She was just a distraction. I belong with Sarah. I belong here, leading this pack." "Then why?" Elisa spoke up, her voice slicing through his frantic denial. "Did you wait until the exact day the transition of power was finalized to plan my departure? Why did you hide the terms of your brother's will from everyone, even Sarah, until it suited you?" The room collectively gasped. Sarah turned to David, her face pale. "David, what does she mean? You said the will was complicated, that it took time to process." David's panic was now palpable. He reached for Sarah, but she recoiled slightly. "Sarah, don't listen to her. She's just bitter. She's trying to ruin us." Julian stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "She doesn't need to ruin you, David. You have done that yourself. The king does not tolerate leaders who manipulate their own people, who discard loyalty for power, who build their reign on deceit." He turned to the elders, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "The king questions the judgment of a man who cannot even recognize the strength of the woman he claimed to love. He questions the honor of a man who uses his best friend's death as a stepping stone." The elders exchanged uneasy glances. The tide was turning. The narrative David had so carefully spun was unraveling before their eyes. The irrelevant human was standing before them, draped in the king's protection, holding the truth like a loaded weapon. Elisa looked at David, seeing him clearly for the first time. The charming facade was gone, leaving only a desperate, fearful man scrambling to hold onto a power he hadn't earned. The satisfaction she had imagined feeling was there, but it was hollow, overshadowed by the profound realization that she had escaped a life built on an illusion. She was free, and he was finally trapped. David's anger, fueled by panic and public humiliation, finally shattered whatever restraint he had left. He lunged, not toward Julian, whose quiet power was an impenetrable wall, but toward Elisa. It was the desperate, unthinking move of a cornered animal. "You bitch!" he roared, his hands reaching for her. He never made it past the first step. Julian didn't strike him. He simply shifted his stance, placing himself entirely between David and Elisa. The movement was fluid, graceful, and devastatingly fast. He caught David by the throat with one hand, lifting him slightly off the ground. The sudden lack of oxygen choked off David's yell, replacing it with a wet, strangled gasp. The ballroom erupted into chaos. Several of David's loyalists stepped forward, their bodies tensing, the subtle, terrifying shifts of impending transformation rippling through them. But Marcus barked an order, his voice finally finding its true authority. "Hold, everyone, hold!" He looked at Julian, the emissary of the king holding their prospective alpha like a misbehaving pup. "Julian, please. He is acting out of shock. Do not kill him." Julian's gaze remained fixed on David, his eyes glowing with an inner, amber light. "He attacked the king's companion. Under our laws, his life is forfeit." Sarah screamed, rushing forward, only to be held back by two of the elders. She looked at Elisa, her eyes wide with terror and pleading. "Please," she cried, "Elisa, please stop him." Elisa looked at the scene unfolding before her. The man who had planned to throw her away like garbage was now dangling, helpless, his face turning a mottled purple. The power she held in this moment was absolute. A single word from her, and Julian would end it. She felt the seductive pull of vengeance, the dark satisfaction of utterly destroying the one who had hurt her. But as she watched David struggle, a profound weariness washed over her. He wasn't a mastermind. He was a coward who had played a dirty game and lost. Killing him wouldn't erase the 6 years she had wasted. It would only tie her to this world of violence and retribution forever. She stepped out from behind Julian's broad shoulder. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. "Let him go," she said softly. Julian didn't move immediately. He kept his grip firm, his gaze boring into David's terrified eyes. "You are certain?" he asked, his voice a low rumble meant only for her. "He does not deserve your mercy." "It's not mercy," Elisa replied, her voice ringing clear in the silent room. "It's indifference. He is irrelevant." She deliberately used his own word, throwing it back at him not with anger, but with absolute crushing finality. Slowly, Julian released his grip. David crumpled to the floor, gasping and coughing, scrambling backward on his hands and knees. The illusion of his power was completely broken. He looked pathetic, a ruined man crawling across the polished marble. Elisa didn't look at him again. She turned to Marcus. "The king suggests you audit the pack's finances, particularly the recent transfers from your late brother's estate. You will find that David's urgency to marry was driven by a need to cover his tracks, not a desire to lead." Marcus turned pale, looking down at his nephew with a mixture of disgust and betrayal. The whispers among the elders started again, but this time they were directed entirely at David. His reign was over before it had even begun. Julian offered Elisa his arm. She took it, feeling a profound sense of lightness. She had faced the storm not as a victim, but as a force of nature. As they walked back down the aisle, the sea of guests parting for them once more, Elisa felt the ruby resting against her chest. It no longer felt like a warning to others. It felt like a symbol of her own forged strength. "That was unexpected," Julian murmured as they neared the grand double doors. "The king will be intrigued." "The king," Elisa said, her head held high, "can keep his intrigue. Our arrangement is complete." Julian paused, looking down at her, a genuine smile finally touching his lips. "Indeed it is." They stepped out into the cool night air, leaving the ruined coronation behind them. The city awoke to a crisp, bright morning, the kind of day that felt washed clean. Elisa stood by the window of the opulent guest suite at Julian's estate, watching the sunlight play across the manicured lawns. The events of the previous night felt like a fever dream, intense and surreal. She had slept deeply, dreamlessly, waking with a clarity she hadn't possessed in years. She poured herself a cup of coffee from the silver carafe left on a side table, savoring the rich, dark roast. It tasted better than any espresso she had made in the cramped cafe. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Enter," she called out. Julian walked in, dressed casually but still exuding that undeniable aura of command. He carried a leather folder. "Good morning," he said, his gaze assessing her. "You seem remarkably calm for a woman who dismantled a pack hierarchy in a single evening." "I merely presented the truth," Elisa replied, taking a sip of her coffee. "They dismantled themselves." Julian chuckled, a rich, resonant sound. "True enough. The fallout has been extensive. Marcus has officially assumed the alpha role permanently. David has been stripped of his rank and his shares. He is currently being held for questioning regarding the financial discrepancies." Elisa nodded slowly. It was the outcome she had expected. Yet hearing it confirmed brought a profound sense of closure. The chapter was definitively finished. "And Sarah?" she asked, a sliver of curiosity remaining. "She has returned to her family's pack. The engagement is broken." It seems she was entirely unaware of David's financial maneuverings. Julian placed the leather folder on a nearby desk. "Which brings us to your future." Elisa turned to face him, setting her cup down. "My future is my own again, as we agreed." "We did," Julian acknowledged. "However, the king is not one to let a debt go unpaid. Your actions prevented a significant destabilization of the region. He wishes to offer his gratitude." Elisa frowned slightly. "I didn't do it for him. I did it for myself. Regardless of your motivation, the result benefited him." Julian countered smoothly. He opened the folder. Inside are the deeds to a small, successful bookstore in a quiet coastal town a few hours from here. There is an apartment above it. The mortgage is fully paid. Elisa stared at the folder, stunned. A bookstore. It was a dream she had mentioned in passing years ago. Something she had foolishly confided in David, who had laughed and called it quaint. "I can't accept this," she said, her voice tight. "It's too much." "It is a fair exchange," Julian insisted. "You provided a service. This is compensation. Consider it a clean break, Elisa. A place where you can be exactly who you wish to be, free from shadows and pack politics." She walked over to the desk, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the leather. It was a staggering gift. An escape route fully funded and prepared. "Why are you doing this, Julianne?" she asked, looking up at him. "This isn't just about the king paying a debt. You could have just given me a check." Julian's expression softened, a rare vulnerability showing in his amber eyes. "Perhaps I saw someone who had spent too long building foundations for others, and I wanted to see what she would build for herself." He reached out, his hand gently touching the ruby still resting at her throat. "You may keep this as well. A reminder of the fire you possess." Elisa covered his hand with her own. "I don't need the ruby to remember," she said softly. She unclasped the necklace, the heavy stone pooling in her palm. She held it out to him. "Take it back. I don't want to carry the king's mark. I want to carry my own." Julian looked at the ruby, then back at her, a profound respect settling in his gaze. He slowly closed her fingers over the gem. "Keep it," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Sell it. Use it to fill your bookstore with rare editions. But do not forget the strength it took to wear it." He stepped back, the brief moment of intimacy passing. "A car is waiting downstairs to take you wherever you wish to go." Elisa watched him walk to the door. "Julian?" she called out. He paused, looking back over his shoulder. "Thank you." He offered a slight bow of his head. "The pleasure was entirely mine, Elisa. Build well." As the door clicked shut, Elisa looked down at the ruby in her hand, then at the leather folder on the desk. The fear and uncertainty that had plagued her for weeks were gone, replaced by a quiet, determined excitement. She was a blank slate, and for the first time, she was holding the pen. The coastal town of Haven Cove smelled of salt spray, wet pine, and the comforting, earthy aroma of old paper. 3 months had passed since the disastrous Sterling wedding, and the biting chill of winter had softened into a crisp, promising spring. Elisa stood on a mahogany rolling ladder, meticulously sliding a pristine, leather-bound first edition onto the highest shelf of her shop. The bookstore, appropriately named The Open Spine, was a masterpiece of reclaimed wood, warm brass fixtures, and overstuffed velvet armchairs. It was everything she had ever envisioned during those long, lonely nights in David's sterile penthouse. And it was entirely hers. She paused, wiping a smudge of dust from her cheek with the back of her wrist. She looked down at the sprawling layout of the shop. In the corner, a state-of-the-art espresso machine gleamed silver under the warm pendant lights. A nod to her brief stint as a barista, and a silent promise that she would never drink a mediocre cup of coffee again. Everything in the shop, from the rare inventory to the espresso machine, had been funded by the ruby. She hadn't kept it. Keeping it would have meant accepting the Alpha King's shadow over her new life, trading one powerful man's cage for another's gilded protection. When she had walked into the most exclusive jeweler in the city and placed the blood-red gem on the velvet counter, the appraiser had physically paled. The funds wired to her account the next day had been astronomical. Julian had warned her to keep it as a reminder, but Elisa had found a better use for her fire. She had used it to build a fortress of her own making. A sharp, cheerful jingle from the brass bell above the front door pulled her from her reverie. The afternoon sky outside was bruised with heavy, purple rain clouds, casting a moody twilight over the street. A tall figure stepped over the threshold, bringing with him the sharp scent of ozone and rain. He wore a heavy charcoal wool coat, the collar turned up against the coastal wind. Even before he lowered his hood, the sheer, undeniable gravity of his presence gave him away. Elisa slowly descended the ladder, her soft-soled boots making no sound on the hardwood floor. "We usually don't get many tourists during the storm season," she said, her voice steady and warm. Julian turned, pushing the hood back to reveal his striking features and those piercing amber eyes. He took in the shop with a slow, deliberate sweep of his gaze, noting the careful curation, the elegant design, and finally, the woman standing before him. "I am not a tourist," Julian replied, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "I am merely a collector of rare things, checking on a particularly fascinating investment." Elisa walked behind the counter, leaning against the polished wood. She felt no fear, no intimidation. The power dynamic had shifted entirely. Here, on her own territory, she was the sovereign. "The investment is thriving. Can I offer you an espresso? It's much better than the swill I served you in the city." "I would be honored," he said, approaching the counter As the espresso machine hissed and ground the beans, filling the air with a rich, dark fragrance, the silence between them was comfortable. It was the silence of two people who had fought in the same trench and emerged on the other side with mutual, unspoken respect. Word reached the king regarding the fate of his ruby. Julian murmured, watching her capable hands work the espresso temp. The supernatural underground was buzzing for weeks. A human woman, casually selling the Alpha King's mark to fund a bookshop. Elisa placed the delicate ceramic demitasse on the counter and met his gaze squarely. Was he angry? Julian chuckled, a low, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate against the glass windows. Angry? No. He was immensely amused. He said it was the most purely dominant move he had witnessed in a decade. He respects sovereignty, Elisa. You claimed yours. Elisa took a sip of her own tea, savoring the warmth. And what of the old kingdom? How is David? She asked the question without a trace of malice or sorrow. It was merely a request for a weather report in a country she no longer visited. Dismantled, Julian said simply, taking a sip of the dark espresso. His eyebrows raised slightly in genuine appreciation of the brew. Marcus initiated a full forensic audit of the PAC's corporate holdings. They found years of David's embezzlement. The elders stripped him of his remaining status and exiled him. He is currently facing human litigation for the missing funds. He has nothing. Not his title, not his wealth, not the woman he sought to use. He built a house on sand, Elisa noted softly. It was only a matter of time before the tide came in. Indeed. Julian set the empty cup down. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small, flat package wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. He slid it across the counter. A housewarming gift. I found it in a private collection in Europe. Elisa untied the twine, pulling back the paper. It was a first edition, signed copy of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. The condition was immaculate. It was a masterpiece, a story of a creator and his creation, of taking parts and forging something entirely new and formidable. Julian, she breathed, genuinely touched. This is incredible. Thank you. You are welcome, he said, stepping back from the counter and buttoning his coat. You were the scaffolding for too long, Elisa. It is a pleasure to see the architect at work. He offered a brief, respectful bow of his head. Be well, Elisa. You too, Julian, she replied. She watched him walk back out into the gathering storm, the bell jingling a cheerful farewell. He disappeared into the mist, a shadow returning to a world of predators and kings. Elisa looked down at the book in her hands, then around at the beautiful, quiet sanctuary she had built from the ashes of her past. The storm outside was raging, but inside the light was warm, the foundations were strong, and she was finally, wonderfully, home. Elisa's journey from a discarded, irrelevant partner to a self-made woman of undeniable strength proves that our darkest moments of betrayal often serve as the catalyst for our greatest transformations. She didn't just survive the storm of pack politics and heartbreak. She used its lightning to forge a new, unshakable identity entirely on her own terms. By choosing her own peace over prolonged vengeance, she achieved the ultimate victory. If you found yourself captivated by Elisa's dramatic transformation and her satisfying triumph over betrayal, please hit the like button. Share this story with anyone who loves a tale of resilience, hidden strength, and ultimate poetic justice. Don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling, dramatic stories of romance, revenge, and redemption.